So he is specifically addressing a question you may have asked here. Listen for God's word. Now, about food sacrificed to idols. We know that we all possess knowledge, but knowledge puffs up, while love builds up. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know. But whoever loves God is known by God. So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols. We know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and there is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things came and for whom we live. And there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live. But not everyone possesses this knowledge. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat sacrificial food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to a god. And since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. But food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do. Be careful, however, that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone with a weak conscience sees you with all your knowledge eating in an idol's temple, won't that person be emboldened to eat what is sacrificed to idols? So this weak brother or sister for whom Christ died is destroyed by your knowledge. When you sin against them in this way and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause them to fall. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. To really understand this passage, we need a little understanding of its first century context. In the first century, especially for those living in Greco-Roman cities like Corinth, this was a huge social problem, particularly a social problem beyond being just a strictly religious or theological one, because almost all the meat that was offered for sale on the general market and all the meat that was served at any kind of family celebration or public celebration had been offered in one way or another as a sacrifice to some kind of idol. So newly born Christians whose families were still engaged in pagan festivals couldn't continue to eat with their own families, attend their celebrations, and be part of the life passages of their families and eat what was being served if they believed that its having been sacrificed to idols created a sin if they ate it. Jews, of course, believed that it was idolatrous to eat such meat, and because of that, as a whole, they obtained the privilege to slaughter their own animals and sell their own kosher meat amongst themselves. But it was almost impossible for newly converted Gentile believers to avoid the social occasions at which such food was offered. Besides which, even all of that aside, for many poor citizens, both Gentile and Jewish, the only meat that they often got to eat because of their poverty and because of the lack of meat in the diet was meat served at public celebrations. So this is a big question in Corinth, in particular, because there are so many Gentile converts there who are also joined with Jewish believers who have avoided this for a long time and think that they know that it's not a big deal. Because, you see, Paul's being asked, can a Christian eat that kind of meat and not sin? Can he share a meal with his friends and family? Can he participate in a celebration or a morning feast? For Jewish boys, of course, one of the very first things that a Jewish child, especially a boy, was taught was the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It was absolutely fundamental, and the Jews stuck to this with a firm tenacity. This was what defined them as separate in the Middle East, that they worshiped one God, and one God alone, and believed that that one God was the creator and sustainer of everything. And Christians had, even those who came from a Gentile background, had embraced that wholehearted understanding of one God within themselves. So if they thoroughly understood and with all their heart, without reservation and with no remaining superstitions, fully believed that God created everything and there is only one God, so that meat that was sacrificed to idols that don't exist is not a problem, because they don't exist. It's a figment of somebody's imagination, right? But you know how people tend to hang on to those kind of nagging superstitions. I would imagine there's probably some of you sitting in this pew who hold to some old wives' tales and superstitions. You might say you don't, but if you have the option of going under a ladder or around, you go around. And I don't think it's a safety concern. We have those kind of emotional things that we, especially that when we grew up with them, that hold on to our hearts, even when our heads know better. And that's what Paul is saying here about some who have the knowledge and some who don't. The knowledge he's talking about is that knowledge and understanding that because idols aren't real, meat sacrificed to them doesn't have anything, there's nothing harmful about it. And yet there are others who know that with their heads, but haven't quite gotten there with their hearts. So that if they participate, their consciences will hurt them. Okay? I think there are two verses in this text that really speak to me and speak to us today in our contemporary context. He starts, and this is one of them, he starts his argument by talking about knowledge, about what good knowledge is for us. I want to go back and read this to you again. We know that we all possess knowledge. In other words, he's saying all of us who are believers have a certain amount of knowledge of what we believe and who God is. But this, and I love this translation, this is the NIV. This is the second part of the first verse. But knowledge puffs up, while love builds up. I kind of recommend learning a verse by heart. At least for me, it's a really important verse for me to keep in mind. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. You know, hot air can lift a lot of weight. Can it? Look at those hot air balloons that we love to watch. How gorgeous they are. And how they can lift and carry people for quite a distance. In construction, people actually use air, quite often, in very large bags to raise heavy weights. Hot air can do a lot, has a lot of power. But when it's punctured, or the heat goes away, what happens? It all comes down. It is nothing but hot air. And when it's withdrawn, everything falls. Love builds up, builds people's self-esteem, builds their character, builds a community of faith. Knowledge here on earth is at best complete. Someone wise said, knowledge is proud that it has learnt so much. Wisdom is humble that it knows no more. There's a big difference between knowledge and wisdom. And love certainly has the most permanent effects of all. The way this verse, let me see here. Verse 3 in the NIV says, but whoever loves God is known by God. Those who think they know something do not as yet know what they ought to know. But whoever loves God is known by God. What Paul's actually doing here is a wonderful little turnaround. It's not very clear in this translation. He's been talking about people's knowledge and the value of knowledge, which he says is important. Obviously, he was a teacher, an evangelist who taught people knowledge of God in Jesus Christ. But he says, what's really important, he turns that around, is not that you know God, but that God knows you. And that's what this verse says. Those who love are known by God. It's great for us to know things about God, but it's a whole lot better to be known by God because of your love for others and for Him. Love builds up. The person who insists on doing anything allowable has failed to learn the Christian way of love. They may know lots of other things, but they haven't learned the heart of it, which is love. In verse 9, he says, be careful that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to others. All of us have to have a concern for what we do in our freedom affects others who may be weak in that particular area. Stumbling block can be intentional, but it can just as easily, or perhaps easier, be unintentional. What seems to be right and is right for one of us is not necessarily right for others. The word that's translated in here, if you cause to fall, cause a brother or sister to fall, is a hard word to translate. Any of you know anything about traps to catch animals? They usually have some kind of a stick or a rod, a device on the inside that sets the trap in motion when it's touched, right? That bait stick is sort of what this word means. It refers to that way of trapping, the trigger that traps someone else in sin. Paul says we all have some knowledge, some of us more than others. But when we use our knowledge improperly, when we force it on others who are not ready to accept it, we have failed to understand the greatest knowledge. I can give you an example, a modern day example for right here in our congregation. A former member of this church came to the nurture committee horrified that on one particular Christmas or Easter, we had put a butterfly on this cross. A butterfly that was made out of the same fabrics that we had used as examples of the 7 great sins during the season of Lent. The idea being that resurrection of taking the old rags and making them something beautiful, a symbol. Now, when we talked to her, one of the things we talked about was knowledge, which is, first of all, that Presbyterians, Protestants, Reformed Christians don't have sacred objects. That things themselves are not sacred. That was our knowledge speaking. So it didn't matter because the cross is a symbol for us. We treat it with reverence. But it is just a symbol. And we added another symbol to it, thereby there was no sin involved for us. But it was creating a huge problem for this person. Even though this person also wore cross jewelry. Okay? We're not always consistent. Our hearts don't necessarily accept everything together. We agreed not to do it again when this person was worshiping with us because it hurt her conscience. It was difficult for this person. That was the right thing to do, and I'm glad we did it. I have to say that I've not always been so smart. And there have been other times that I insisted that I and others have insisted, this is what Presbyterians do and this is the way we're going to do it. And I was wrong. And I suspect I'm not the only one who has insisted on their own way. The bottom line here is, we live in a society today that is hugely individualistic, who believes that they have rights way beyond what their rights really are, and that they want them, and they want them right now. And they don't care if anyone else has rights that they are stepping on. So as good citizens, of course the saying is that our rights stop where someone else's begin. Someone else's rights begin. Paul is telling you that for Christians, the ante goes a lot higher. Because it's not where someone else's rights begin that our rights end, but that our rights should end where another Christian's needs begin. That's a big step, and it's tough. Now, I'm not saying that we should be so afraid of what others might think that we lose our freedom and joy. This is not a matter of satisfying everybody's attitudes about everything. But when our behavior potentially creates real stress in other people's faith, then Paul says, love trumps our rights. Are there habits or attitudes in our lives which could be stumbling blocks to other Christians? Things that we're so sure we know what's right to do that we harm the faith of others? With God's help, I hope that we can turn those stumbling blocks into building blocks for the community of faith, for that person, that other person, and for ourselves. Amen. Our response, we're going to sing first our hymn of response, which is "Make Me a Blessing."